I was going to say some words on why I feel that comment sections, that is to say, comments you see on news videos, particularly, I'm not talking so much about, for example, a small channel like this, but on news stations, shouldn't necessarily be taken to represent the whole opinion. Um, I mean, as an example, if you look at reports about Putin, um, it's not unreasonable to conclude that they're going to attract a lot of pro-Putin comments. It's almost like the trolls come out of the woodwork, or the Russian bots come out of the woodwork, or the useful idiots come out of the woodwork. And yet we know that the majority of Britons are anti-Putin. They see him for what he is. So I don't believe that comments on a video should be taken to be the consensus of opinion. I mean, for one thing, not everyone has a YouTube account. So a lot of people will watch videos and not comment. In fact, the majority of people will do that. So you may get a situation, for example, where, I don't know, 80% of people, 90% of people say, oh, that's awful, yeah, he's a dictator, etc., etc. But then the minority of apologists will feel the need to comment. Um, so that's what I was going to focus on, but instead I'll focus more on the speeches given by Keir Starmer and Foreign Secretary David Lammy at the UN, because they're encouraging. I thought they were good speeches, insofar as it wasn't the usual sort of cautious diplomatic language. Both Starmer and Lammy were not pulling the punches, they were not holding back on their take on Russia. And I find that refreshing, frankly. Very often, British politicians tend to be masters of the understatement. They'll use words like disappointed and unfortunate. It's just watered down language. Starmer and Lammy, not at all. And Starmer is hardly, he's a dull man. He's not exactly a wonderful orator, but he hit the right notes. He said that 89 countries at the Swiss Peace Conference um, said that an absolute precondition of peace has to be respect for Ukraine's sovereign rights. That's a prerequisite. Um, Zelensky has said Ukraine wants peace. I have no doubt the people of Ukraine want peace, but I don't think they want peace at absolutely any price. Starmer basically said, how can the Russian delegation show its face when they have so violated UN principles? Um, and he also quoted Yaroslav Basilevich, the man who lost his family, his wife and two daughters, in an airstrike in Lviv. I remember seeing the funeral procession of that, and it was horrendous. I mean, to lose one member of one family would be awful, but this guy had lost everyone, and one can't imagine what someone like that is going through, and it's replicated many times over. But he sort of became a face of Ukrainian suffering, and he was still literally scarred from the blast. Um, so that was Starmer's take on it. By the way, I'm going to put links to these videos. David Lammy, even more vocal. Um, you know, you could tell this wasn't just like a diplomatic thing he was reading out. It was, with conviction. Um, and he called Russia a mafia state. That's what it is. If anyone doubts that, I would invite them to read Mafia State by Luke Harding. In fact, I don't know if maybe Lammy has read that and he borrowed the title from that, but it's accurate. I mean, if you look at the way Putin's regime operates, it is pretty accurate. Um, Not mafia in the sense of the Italian mafia, but it's in terms of behaving like an organized criminal outfit, then really the parallels are striking. Except in the case of the Russian regime, we're talking about a national government and the head of state, and a powerful one at that. Um, he also made an interesting point, which, some on the right may say, oh, it's Lamy being left wing. I actually think it was an important point. He said, I know imperialism when I see it. Putin claims to represent the global south. As a black man who's an ancestor of slaves, who, were forced into that at a barrel of a gun. He knows colonialism when he sees it, imperialism, excuse me, when he sees it, and he will call it out. Now, some might cynically look at that and say, oh, that's Lammy playing left wing politics, but I actually think it's significant because Russian propaganda has been going overdrive in the developing world, particularly the global south, particularly Africa. And I've always found it astonishing that African countries would think that, I actually think supporting Russia is somehow in their favor because the war in Ukraine has affected grain supplies. It has a reverberation all over the world. I think some of it comes about in countries like Mali and Niger from, a mistrust in the French. I think that's part of it. But, I think I would implore Africans to not shake hands with the devil and think that Putin is the answer. Of course, Africa is a continent, there's different situations in different countries. But by making that point, Lamy is, he was making it in a way that a white foreign secretary, frankly, couldn't have. Um, and that's powerful. I like the fact he's not mincing his words. And I like the fact he's outspoken on this. The Starmer government's been in power for almost 100 days. I'll probably do a video on that. I'm certainly critical of some aspects of it. I'm not a big fan of the early prisoner release, necessary as it may have been. There's a lot of things I'm uneasy about on the domestic front, and certainly the winter fuel payment issue is bad PR for Starmer. There's going to be a lot of areas to criticise. Um, but when we look at foreign policy, it's so far not. I mean, it's early days, but I do like the fact that Starmer and Lammy are taking a hard line with Russia. And I think language matters. One of my issues with James Cleverly was he was far too cautious in his language. Now, there is a case that, statesmen cannot be bombastic and just throw things out. I understand that. But I also think you need to set the right tone. And I think Cleverly was just too cautious in his words, in contrast to Lamy, who's a lot more outspoken. Um, I find it refreshing, quite frankly. With regard to Israel and the situation there, here's the thing: the Labour Party still supports Israel. I mean, the heckler at the Labour conference in Liverpool was heckling Reeves precisely because the government still supports Israel, and scaling back our armaments to our arms supplies to, I think it was a very small fraction um, that we actually took away. It is almost meaningless because the overall contribution is overwhelmingly from the United States. So to take back a little fraction of the little portion that we gave to Israel in the first place just seems almost meaningless. Um, of course, the Netanyahu government is angry about it, but I'll say again, I do not think that this country, um, should absolutely be obliged to give Israel support without question, particularly when a lot of civilians have been killed in Gaza and in Lebanon. Um, but we recognize Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. It is a terrorist organization, and it's right that we continue to support the principle that Israel can defend itself. But, there's a lot on the right in this country, and if you look who would basically view that as a betrayal of Israel, I think any support for any country, and I even include Ukraine, although I think it's a very different context, but I think it is right that we ask questions. And when there is serious ground for suspicion that war crimes have been committed, then it's absolutely justified that we reanalyze what we are supporting because we get tied with that by proxy. Um, and the United States and Israel can criticize us for that, but we are a sovereign nation, and Israel and the United States has to respect that, allies as they may be. We are a sovereign nation, and I am actually, although in a way it annoyed both sides because the right saw it as a blow toward Israel, and the left saw it as watered down and too weak. Um, in a way, the Democrats are sort of doing the same thing in the US, although they continue supporting Israel. They have condemned the heavy civilian losses. This is something to remember. Netanyahu's government um, kind of has the green light to do what it does because of British and American support. I don't think if you had two powerful countries, i.e., Britain and the United States, supporting Israel so blindly, would Israel be able to do some of the things it's doing now? Again, many Israelis have been displaced. Hezbollah is firing rockets into Israel. They're not toys. It is a state of war. I think it would be absurd to expect Israel to do nothing. But when Israel strikes, it strikes hard. And they say they give warnings. I'm not so sure. I do think there are, even regardless of what Israel is doing, I do not like the mentality that I see from a lot of right wingers, pro Israelis, which is a desensitized mentality towards Lebanese civilians or Palestinian civilians. Um, and there's this kind of false narrative that if you express concerns, you're somehow pro Hezbollah. That's ridiculous. It's perfectly compatible to say Hezbollah is a vicious terrorist organization. I do blame them primarily for this escalation. They had no business dragging Lebanon into a war the way they have. But uh, I think there are people who have this mindset that only Israeli civilians matter. Um, and you have to be made of stone to see Lebanese children fleeing with their families to the capital and not think this is not something to celebrate. When I see memes kind of making jokes about the situation and, kind of blindly praising Israel without taking these things on board, it bothers me. It does bother me. So I'm pleased that our government is scaling back a little bit and saying actually we're not going to just apologize to Israel and do exactly what they want. I do think it's healthy to question that blind support a bit because after all, most other Western countries have done so. Why should it be just Britain and America that takes this position of giving Israel blind support? I don't agree with that. I think we should support Israel to an extent. Now, people might say, well, Nathan, that's hypocritical because you're talking about support for Ukraine. The situation is very different. Russia invaded Ukraine. In the case of Israel, it's a security situation where you've had Hezbollah and Hamas firing rockets into Israel. So, in that sense, Israel has been threatened. But, today's news is there may be plans for a ground offensive in Lebanon, even though Israel has said they don't want a war with Lebanon. Lebanon's a sovereign country, and I think that I just think it's wrong to draw these analogies between Ukraine and Israel. I think in both wars you have a lot of civilian suffering. Now, in the Ukraine war, it's overwhelmingly Ukrainian civilians, and in Israel's wars with Gaza and with Lebanon, it's overwhelmingly the Palestinians and now the Lebanese. And yes, Israelis have suffered as well. Um, But I have a big problem with the attitude that only Israeli civilians matter. I think there is that mentality. I mean, if you look at the BBC's been heavily criticised, but if you look at the coverage by the likes of the Daily Telegraph, they'll barely cover, um, the situation for Lebanese civilians or Palestinian civilians. It's entirely focused on the situation with Israel. So the BBC deserves a lot of criticism, but frankly, I trust it more to show that side. Um, you get bias in all outlets. I mean, Al Jazeera is going to be biased against Israel, but I think when I look at all the networks, the BBC is far from perfect, but frankly, it's probably better than some. Um, and it's being fiercely criticized right now because people have this mentality, I think, that Israel is above reproach or should be above reproach. That's a very unhealthy way of thinking. I would even say, and again, I think there's differences between the wars, but I would even say that Ukraine isn't above scrutiny. I mean, I think we should give Ukraine long range missiles to finish this thing, but it's justified to say, well, what is your strategy? What are the targets going to be? What are you going to do to ensure there isn't Russian civilian casualties? Those are all valid questions if we are giving extensive support to Ukraine, and I believe we should. Um, but I think it's important to differentiate between these conflicts because there are very different situations. Um, and I don't think it's hypocritical to support Ukraine extensively, but draw more questions regarding support for Israel. Um, and as for, I'll just close on this. It's got nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is abhorrent, and it's worth pointing out that many Israelis are very critical of Netanyahu's approach. Um, but every country in the world has a right to defend its own citizens. Israel does have a right to do that. I just think that the extent of civilian suffering, I mean, it's all very well Israel saying, oh, we've given people warnings. It's kind of a disclaimer, and certainly Hezbollah doesn't bother giving Israeli civilians warnings. But where the hell are those people supposed to go? This is the thing I find quite galling. We've given them warnings, so that makes it okay. But where are they supposed to go? They're going to go to Beirut. Beirut's going to be bombed. So, if Israel's making that line of argument, then it contradicts itself when they then bomb the very places where they've told civilians to go to. Lebanon's a very small country, so where are those people supposed to go? It's also a sovereign nation. Um, but of course, the issue there is that the Lebanese government's very weak. It's got little control over Hezbollah. But I would say that we need to balance out any criticism of Israel with extensive criticism of Iran. I will say though, and I will definitely round up with this, those who say that the left somehow, I'm talking about the centre left governments of Keir Starmer and Joe Biden, are somehow anti-Israel. It's a delusional argument. Trump's claiming that Jews who don't support him are anti-Israel. Toxic, divisive language that isn't accurate, actually, particularly when both the British and American governments are continuing to support Israel. It's very cynical and false. Um, Incidentally, I don't say we should absolutely cut off all arms to Israel, but I think that we need to look at this. I think we need to look at it because the situation in Lebanon, it's a sovereign nation. And I think when London just blindly goes along with everything Israel does, and we're not doing that, but the premise that we should do that, it actually damages our international image. So that's why I don't go along with it. And I want a prime minister and a foreign secretary who have the backbone to say, actually, we're not going to just go along with everything America does. As much as I respect the Biden-Harris administration, I don't think we should just blindly go along with the American position every time. So, in conclusion, I think I haven't even mentioned China. That's time will tell how robust Starmer and Lammy are going to be with China. That may be for another video. But as it stands, when it comes to foreign policy, I would give Starmer, particularly given his diplomatic visits to Germany and other European countries, I would give Starmer and Lammy on foreign policy 7 out of 10. I think they've been quite strong so far. Um, I'm quite reassured by that.